Aboard Saratoga, Thomas Macdonough faced a problem that should have ended the battle. His engaged cannon were becoming useless. Across the smoke-covered water, the British flagship still blocked the bay, while an invading army waited beyond the shoreline. If the American line collapsed, British ships could control Lake Champlain and sustain the advance deeper into New York. Macdonough could not sail clear, and ordinary turning depended upon wind that had already betrayed both squadrons that morning. Yet his flagship carried something easily overlooked beneath the smoke: extra anchors and cables arranged before battle for precisely this emergency. Those cables would not make his squadron stronger. They would let damaged ships bring unused cannon toward the enemy. The maneuver soon decided more than a naval contest, because George Prevost's entire invasion depended upon securing victory afloat. To understand why an anchor could halt thousands of soldiers, the story must return 5 days along the northern road. On September 6th, more than 10,000 British troops advanced beside Lake Champlain and entered Plattsburgh from the north. They represented Britain's strongest opportunity in this theater since the war had begun, reinforced by experienced troops from Europe. Britain no longer needed every veteran against Napoleon. His defeat in Europe had released formations for service across the Atlantic. Prevost intended to seize the American base at Plattsburgh, destroy its squadron, and secure uncontested control of the lake. That objective was strategic rather than symbolic. Lake Champlain opened a north-south corridor toward the Hudson River Valley beyond. An army could march beside the water, but roads alone could not easily support a large, sustained advance southward. Ships controlling the lake could move supplies, protect communications, and prevent American vessels from threatening the invasion's exposed flank. Prevost therefore planned a joint operation. His soldiers would cross the Saranac while British warships defeated Macdonough offshore nearby. Neither arm could deliver the intended result independently. The fleet needed land pressure, and the army needed waterborne security. From Prevost's perspective, the balance appeared favorable. His field force greatly outnumbered the defenders assembled around Plattsburgh that week. Alexander Macomb commanded roughly 1,500 regulars and about 2,500 militia, a mixed defense facing overwhelming pressure ashore. Their strongest position lay across the Saranac River, where guarded bridges narrowed the routes available to approaching British columns. British troops occupied Plattsburgh west of the river, placing camps and formations close enough to test every crossing point. Macomb could not reasonably seek an open battle against that force. He made the riverline multiply limited manpower. Defensive positions covered approaches, defenders watched the bridges, and familiar streets became channels where superior numbers mattered less at once. Militia reinforced regulars behind prepared positions, allowing Macomb to distribute scarce manpower among crossings rather than meet British columns in open ground. The British advance had reached the obstacle, but possession of the western town did not open the southern road. To continue safely, Prevost needed the lake secured, and Macomb's attention divided by a coordinated attack from both sides. His army was ready before the naval squadron. Captain George Downey's ships did not arrive until September 11th. That delay left thousands of British soldiers near the Saranac, waiting while the operation's essential second arm assembled offshore. Time favored neither side cleanly. Macomb strengthened crossings, while Prevost consumed supplies and preserved coordination rather than attack alone. Holding back was not simple timidity. An unsupported victory ashore could become useless if American ships retained the lake. Macdonough's squadron therefore served as a floating barrier behind Macomb, even before either side fired upon the other. It contained 14 vessels: Saratoga, Eagle, Ticonderoga, Preble, and 10 gunboats arranged to defend Plattsburgh Bay rather than seek open water. Anchoring inside the bay surrendered freedom of movement, yet it forced an approaching enemy to enter Macdonough's chosen ground. British long guns offered an advantage at distance. American cannon were generally shorter ranged but heavier once ships closed in. On open water, Downey could exploit range and movement. Inside the anchorage, geometry could compress those advantages quickly enough. A fixed line also carried danger. Once anchored, a ship could expose only one broadside toward the enemy line. Damaged guns on that side could not simply be replaced by untouched cannon facing away across the deck behind them. Macdonough, prepared for that exact limitation, by laying additional anchors and control cables before the British squadron appeared offshore. Hauling those cables could rotate a vessel in place, presenting its opposite battery without waiting for useful wind conditions. By September 11th, both commands had reached their chosen positions. The invasion now depended upon coordination across water and river. At Plattsburgh Bay, Macdonough converted immobility into a defensive instrument, choosing where Downey must approach and how his ships would face him. The American line ran roughly north to south, positioned so British vessels entering the bay would meet concentrated broadsides. Saratoga held the central responsibility as Macdonough's flagship, while Eagle, Ticonderoga, Prevost, and gunboats extended the anchored formation around her. Each vessel covered part of the approach, making the line mutually supporting without requiring complicated movement after battle began. Macdonough knew his heavier short-range cannon became useful only after the British entered distances their longer guns were designed to avoid. Downey therefore had reason to preserve range, maintain formation, and punish the anchored ships before closing decisively inside the bay. Yet geography limited his choices. Shoals and the American alignment constrained the angle from which his squadron could engage. The confrontation was not simply heavier guns against longer ones, it was a contest over distance, orientation, and time. At the Saranac, Prevost watched that contest because every hour of delay complicated his own crossing plans against Macomb. His troops could pressure several bridges and fords, forcing the defenders to spread attention along the river under constant strain. Crossing in strength required more than reaching the opposite bank. British columns needed confidence that their supply route remained protected. Naval defeat would leave the lake hostile behind them, turning every mile south into a harder logistical commitment for Prevost. Thus the Army waited for Downey, even though delay allowed Macomb to improve defenses and gather local support nearby. Prevost planned to begin his main assault when British naval action fixed Macdonough and promised control offshore at Plattsburgh. Coordination sounds straightforward on a map, but smoke, distance, uncertain timing, and separate commanders made synchronization fragile in practice. Downey's arrival on September 11th finally supplied the missing piece, though it gave him little time to reconnoiter carefully. His squadron included Confidence, Linnet, Chubb, Finch, and 12 gunboats, enough to challenge Macdonough's anchored force directly inside the bay. Downey arranged his 4 principal ships abreast, intending a direct advance supported by gunboats and long-range fire during the approach. A broad approach could bring several British batteries into action together, rather than feed vessels separately toward the American line. The plan assumed enough wind to preserve spacing and steerage. As the squadron entered, that assumption began failing quickly. A dying wind disrupted Downey's formation, reducing control precisely when the ships needed coordinated positions and clear fields of fire. British vessels still advanced, firing their longer-ranged guns while Macdonough's anchored line waited for more effective distances inside Plattsburgh Bay. Every yard gained by the attackers increased American striking power, but turning away would abandon Prevost's required naval decision. Downey's squadron was committed by strategy as much as momentum. The Army's advance had made caution increasingly expensive that morning. When the lines engaged closely, the difference between gun types became physical. Heavy American broadsides battered timber and rigging. British fire answered with disciplined force, striking Saratoga and Eagle along the starboard sides presented toward Downey at anchor. Smoke obscured signals and alignment, while damaged rigging and disturbed crews made every correction slower than planned on both sides. Macdonough's fixed line now provided an unexpected benefit. His captains did not need wind to hold their general positions. Its weakness emerged just as clearly. Cannon facing the British absorbed damage, while untouched batteries pointed uselessly away from the fight. Eagle suffered heavily among the forward American vessels, weakening the line's ability to sustain its original volume of fire. Farther south, Ticonderoga and Prevost confronted British vessels and gunboats whose pressure prevented easy reinforcement of Saratoga or Eagle. No untouched reserve waited behind Macdonough. Every vessel already carried responsibility for a particular section of water within the bay. Aboard Confidence, Downey was killed during the exchange, leaving the British flagship damaged amid an already disordered formation under fire. His death did not instantly end British resistance, but it removed central command when coordinated adjustments mattered most across the squadron. Saratoga continued firing from her engaged side, yet repeated damage steadily reduced the cannon Macdonough could use effectively against Confidence. If nothing changed, the American flagship would remain anchored in position with substantial firepower trapped on her opposite side. That was the condition Macdonough's preparations addressed. Anchor lines beneath the water offered control independent of sails or shattered rigging. Using them under fire demanded coordination, because releasing the wrong cable could expose Saratoga, foul her position, or lose alignment. The solution, therefore, was not a sudden inspiration. Its materials, geometry, and purpose had been arranged before Downey arrived. With Saratoga's active battery fading, preparation became action. The crew began hauling the lines that could rotate her within the anchorage. The crew's task began with cables already led from Saratoga toward anchors placed beyond her bow and stern. By hauling one line while easing another, sailors could make the anchored flagship pivot slowly across the calm water. Such a turn demanded controlled tension because drifting too far could break the American line or mask neighboring guns. Ordinary ship handling relied upon sails and rudder, but neither offered dependable control amid weak wind and damaged rigging. Macdonough had removed that uncertainty before combat by treating his anchorage as machinery rather than merely shelter for his squadron. Preparation did not guarantee success. It gave Saratoga another usable fighting position after her first position became untenable under fire. Rotating a warship while enemy broadsides struck nearby remained dangerous, and every sailor hauling cable worked without seeing its anchor. Smoke made the operation harder, concealing distances and leaving shouted orders, practiced routines, and cable tension to guide the crew. Officers could not pause the battle while reorganizing. Saratoga had to keep resisting as men shifted her orientation under sustained fire. Her surviving starboard cannon still answered when possible, protecting the maneuver from becoming an obvious interval of silence for British crews. Across the narrowing gap, Confidence remained heavily engaged despite losing Downey, her surviving officers confronting damage and broken coordination. Neither flagship could simply withdraw. Their fleets, armies, and commanders had already tied the campaign to this exchange of fire. Elsewhere, Linnet and Chubb remained within the British attack, but neither could restore the formation lost during the approach. Farther along the line, Ticonderoga and Preble kept Finch and accompanying gunboats from concentrating freely against Saratoga at center. Each local fight influenced the others because a vessel breaking through could attack an anchored opponent from another angle. British range had mattered during the approach, and American ships had absorbed punishment before their heavier cannon became fully effective. Now proximity reversed that relationship, turning every British effort to hold position into continued exposure to heavier American fire. Downey's death deepened the problem without making surrender inevitable. Individual ships could still fight according to their immediate circumstances. British crews had reasonable grounds to persist. Saratoga looked badly damaged, and Eagle had also lost effective starboard fire. If both major American vessels became silent before turning, Downey's squadron might still rupture the defensive line inside the bay. From shore, Prevost could observe smoke and hear the exchange, but he could not inspect each battery's condition across the water. His information arrived as impressions, ships holding position, flags remaining aloft, and gunfire continuing somewhere inside the haze offshore. That uncertainty complicated coordination. The land assault had begun, committing British troops against crossings Macomb had prepared to defend. British columns pressing the river still needed naval victory to make any successful crossing operationally secure for further advance. Macomb's defenders faced superior numbers, yet bridges confined movement and prevented all that strength from arriving together at once. Every defended crossing bought time for the naval battle, while every broadside offshore helped sustain the river defense in turn. The operation had reached its most fragile moment. Success in either arena still depended upon events in the other. Prevost could not know whether Saratoga's fading fire signaled imminent collapse or merely concealed a prepared change of position. Aboard Saratoga, cable teams continued hauling. The flagship began to turn, slowly changing which gun ports faced Confidence through smoke. Movement exposed a new risk because rotation temporarily disturbed the broadside angle Macdonough had established before the engagement began. Neighboring vessels had to continue covering their sectors while Saratoga passed through the vulnerable middle of her swing under fire. British gunners could see the hull changing angle, though smoke and damage obscured what Macdonough intended to gain next. An anchored ship turning away might appear disabled, drifting, or attempting escape, rather than bringing another battery into action. That ambiguity lasted only while the cables moved Saratoga. Once her opposite side aligned, the purpose would become unmistakable. Along the opposite side, port cannon remained comparatively intact because the hull itself had shielded them during the exchange. Their crews had waited beside weapons pointing away from battle, hearing damage accumulate beyond the timber behind them for long minutes. Rotation transformed those unused guns from trapped weight into a fresh broadside without moving Saratoga from her defensive station. Macdonough's preparation had effectively divided his flagship's endurance between two sides, forcing the British to defeat both in sequence. As the port battery came to bear, Saratoga recovered striking power at the moment her original side seemed finished. The fresh guns opened on Confidence, and the battle's balance began shifting inside the same anchored patch of water. Fresh port guns now faced Confidence, restoring a volume of fire the British flagship had reason to believe was exhausted. No reinforcement had arrived. Saratoga's untouched port battery entered the fight only because cables had turned her hull within the anchorage. Confidence, already battered and deprived of Downey's direction, now received heavy fire from guns that had scarcely participated before. British gunners answered, but damage had reduced their ability to exploit Saratoga's exposed moments or suppress her renewed broadside. The apparent American collapse had therefore produced the opposite result: a fresh line of cannon at nearly the same range. Macdonough's method did not erase earlier losses. It converted surviving equipment into immediate force before Confidence could finish the contest. That distinction explains the maneuver's power. Preparation changed the sequence of destruction, compelling Britain to overcome a second effective battery. Confidence lacked an equivalent recovery under mounting damage, and her position offered little room to escape the American fire. Smoke still concealed details from shore, but the sound of renewed American broadsides contradicted any expectation that Saratoga was finished. For Prevost, every additional exchange prolonged the uncertainty surrounding an army already committed against the Saranac crossings that morning. British troops moved against defended approaches where riverbanks and bridges compressed formations that greatly outnumbered Macomb's available regulars and militia. Local pressure could force Americans backward, yet tactical progress would matter only if the fleet secured communications along Lake Champlain. Prevost's problem was becoming sharper. Continuing ashore risked advancing beyond naval support, while hesitation surrendered time to Macomb's defenders. His caution had operational logic, because an army south of Plattsburgh would require supplies across territory still bordered by hostile water. Macomb needed no decisive counterattack. Holding the crossings long enough allowed Macdonough's squadron to determine whether the invasion remained sustainable. Thus, smoke over the bay functioned like an unanswered order, delaying certainty while both land forces maintained dangerous commitments. Inside that smoke, Confidence's return fire weakened as Saratoga's fresh battery continued striking her hull and remaining working guns. Command disruption compounded physical damage. Downey's surviving officers inherited a battle whose formation, timing, and flagship had already been compromised. They were not facing a foolish plan suddenly exposed. They were facing a reasonable approach whose assumptions had failed together. Wind had weakened, spacing had deteriorated, Downey was gone, and Saratoga possessed a second broadside hidden by her original orientation. Any one difficulty might have been manageable. Combined, they prevented British advantages in range and initiative from producing control. Confidence remained the largest immediate threat, so Macdonough kept Saratoga's renewed fire concentrated where its loss would matter most. The British flagship's damage accumulated faster than her crew could restore effective resistance under close American broadsides inside the bay. Her eventual surrender did not instantly settle every local engagement, but it removed the squadron's strongest center and organizing presence. A lowered British flag carried meaning beyond one deck. Nearby vessels now fought without realistic hope that confidence would recover. Eagle had faced the same mechanical problem as Saratoga, with her engaged starboard battery damaged and port guns turned away. Anchor work allowed Eagle to change her presentation as well, preserving American fire where ordinary maneuver remained unreliable nearby. The two turns reveal a squadron-wide concept rather than one lucky improvisation aboard the flagship during crisis that morning. Macdonough had anticipated attrition along an anchored line and prepared a way to expose reserve firepower without abandoning position. That system depended on crews executing difficult cable work after casualties, damage, smoke, and noise had disrupted normal routines. Preparation mattered because it reduced decisions required during emergency. Sailors followed an arranged method instead of inventing movement from nothing. Southward, Ticonderoga and Prevost still faced Finch and British gunboats, preventing them from exploiting confusion around the American center. Their fight remained costly. Prevost suffered heavy damage while the smaller vessels operated in water where movement and angles changed rapidly. Ticonderoga's resistance helped deny the British an opening against Saratoga after confidence lost the ability to stabilize their line. Finch was forced toward shore and grounded, removing another British vessel from effective participation in the central contest nearby. Preblay's condition showed the American victory was never effortless. Parts of Macdonough's line had approached their own breaking points. British gunboats still complicated the water around them, while Linnet and Chubb remained capable of prolonging resistance farther north. Confidence's surrender changed their prospects, not their immediate ability to fire. Each captain still judged damage, position, and support. Linnet continued resisting after the flagship yielded, forcing the Americans to redirect attention rather than assume the squadron had collapsed. Across the bay, separate British positions were failing at different speeds, and the final decision had not yet reached shore. Confidence's surrender freed Saratoga to direct attention toward British vessels still resisting along the fractured line inside Plattsburgh Bay. Linnet had fought effectively against Eagle, and now continued alone, despite losing the support expected from Downey's flagship nearby. Chubb had taken repeated hits and struck her colors, removing another British ship from a battle whose structure was rapidly dissolving. Finch, driven ashore by pressure from the Southern American vessels, could no longer perform her intended role within Downey's squadron. British gunboats remained afloat, but the larger ships that anchored their attack were surrendering, grounding, or fighting in isolation. This changed the tactical arithmetic around Lionnet because American fire could converge without confidence dominating Saratoga at the center. Still, Linnet did not immediately yield. Her crew maintained resistance, while damage and isolation narrowed every remaining practical option. Macdonough could now bring renewed guns against her, demonstrating how Saratoga's rotation affected enemies beyond its original opponent nearby. Eagle also remained engaged, preserving pressure from the northern portion of an American line that had nearly gone silent earlier. Linnet's position became untenable as supporting ships disappeared and American batteries continued firing from their prepared anchorage across the bay. Eventually, Linnet struck her colors, ending organized resistance among the principal British vessels committed against Macdonough that morning offshore. The outcome was now unmistakable afloat, even though smoke, damage, and scattered gunboats made the bay appear still unsettled. The British squadron had entered seeking control of Lake Champlain. Instead, its principal ships were captured, surrendered, or disabled. Macdonough's squadron remained badly damaged, but possession of the battlefield and the lake route now belonged to the Americans. Victory emerged from several connected conditions, not from the turning maneuver alone, though that maneuver supplied the decisive recovery. Anchoring had forced Downey inward, the dying wind had disrupted his approach, and close range favored heavier American cannon. Then, the cable system allowed Saratoga and Eagle to recover firepower after their exposed batteries became badly damaged in action. Those advantages compounded rather than operating separately, turning British setbacks into a collapse no isolated ship could reverse alone. Downey's death mattered within that chain, but British defeat cannot be explained as one commander's sudden absence by itself. The battle had already constrained his movement, compressed his range advantage, and tied his squadron to Prevost's schedule ashore. News did not need elaborate reports. Prevost could see British flags falling and American control surviving offshore before him. His land attack was already underway, but its strategic foundation had disappeared with Downey's squadron inside the bay nearby. A successful crossing could still dislodge some defenders, yet it could not restore secure movement along Lake Champlain southward. Continuing would commit more soldiers beyond the Saranac, while American vessels directly threatened transport, supply, and communications behind them. Prevost therefore revoked the assault rather than test whether superior numbers could compensate for lost naval support that day. This order became controversial because his army remained powerful, and Macdonoug's defending force was considerably smaller along the river. Judged only at the crossings, withdrawal could resemble surrendering a favorable land contest before its strength was fully exhausted. Prevost saw a broader problem. The invasion aimed beyond one riverbank and required continued control of its northern lifeline. Without that control, each advance enlarged the distance between his troops and reliable support while exposing waterborne movement behind. His choice was therefore rational within the operation's design, even if contemporaries disputed whether retreat was necessary immediately then. Macdonoug's defense had helped create that choice by denying quick passage before the naval result became clear to Prevost. Bridges and guarded approaches had converted limited American manpower into delay, preventing Prevost from separating the two battles decisively. If British troops had crossed earlier, they might have changed Macdonough's circumstances or forced American attention away from shore. Instead, the river line held long enough for the naval contest to impose its outcome upon the army ashore. Orders moved through British formations, ending attacks that soldiers near the crossings could still have believed achievable that morning. The withdrawal began under circumstances unlike a rout. Organized units remained numerous and retained their immediate fighting capacity ashore. Yet, strategic defeat can precede tactical destruction. Prevost's army had lost the condition that made further advance supportable southward. Camps and stores now had to be considered against speed because delay risked pressure from Americans controlling the lake. Prevost prepared to pull north toward Canada, leaving Macomb across the Saranac and Macdonough in possession of the bay. The victory afloat had stopped the attack, but the scale, meaning, and cost of the retreat still remained to unfold. On the day after the naval defeat, Prevost directed his army north, abandoning the advance beyond Plattsburgh toward New York. Retreating columns followed the road beside Lake Champlain, the same corridor whose usefulness depended upon British control of the water. Soldiers had not been defeated in a general land battle, which made the order difficult to understand from their immediate positions. Before them, Macomb's smaller force still guarded crossings, while behind them stood formations capable of renewing pressure along the Saranac. Yet, numbers could not repair the missing fleet, and Prevost judged continued operations too exposed without naval support or supply security. A road running northward could carry men, wagons, and messages, but it lacked the capacity and flexibility of lake transport. American vessels surviving in the bay could now threaten movement on the water and complicate any British advance along its shore. The original operation had combined army and squadron, so each protected the other's weakness. Defeat separated those strengths at once. Prevost's withdrawal preserved his army from deeper commitment, but it conceded the campaign's immediate objective without another major contest ashore. Critics could point to British superiority on land, while Prevost could point to the unsupported communications any victory would create. Both arguments begin from real conditions. Their disagreement concerns how much risk the invasion could accept after losing the lake. His order also reveals the campaign's actual center of gravity. Plattsburgh mattered because of the corridor, not merely the town. Once the corridor became unusable, taking additional ground could burden the British Army without advancing its strategic purpose. Macomb had therefore succeeded without destroying Prevost's force. He held the obstacle until another arm decided the operation. The river defenses were modest compared with the army facing them, but their value came from timing and placement. Each delayed crossing protected the naval anchorage from land interference and preserved Macdonough's opportunity to finish the battle offshore. In return, Macdonough's victory removed the pressure that superior British numbers might eventually have imposed upon those defenses. Neither defense alone explains the result. Their interaction made one anchored squadron capable of determining an army's next movement. In the bay, the silence after organized resistance exposed the damage hidden by smoke while the battle was underway. Saratoga and Eagle had survived only after rotating, and Preble had suffered heavily during the southern portion of the engagement. The principal British vessels were surrendered, captured, or disabled, leaving their crews under American control amid damaged ships and rigging. Casualty totals vary by accounting, but the American side lost roughly 100 dead and about 120 wounded. British losses were heavier. The official summary gives roughly 380 killed or wounded across the operation overall. More than 300 British personnel were also reported captured or deserted, adding a human cost beyond the damaged squadron. These figures measure suffering, not the mechanism of victory. That mechanism remained visible in cables stretched across Saratoga's scarred deck. Without those prepared lines, Macdonough might have lacked any reliable way to present his undamaged port battery during the crisis. Wind could not be commanded, and damaged rigging reduced conventional maneuver. Anchors gave his crew a controllable alternative within those limits. This was engineering at a practical scale, using familiar naval equipment to preserve combat power after predictable damage accumulated. Macdonough did not foresee every event. He prepared for the broader possibility that one exposed broadside would become unusable. The distinction separates planning from prophecy. Good preparation did not predict Downey's death or the dying wind that disrupted formation. It created options under uncertainty, allowing an American crew to act when conditions removed the most obvious means of movement. Downey's choices deserve the same context. He had to attack an anchored enemy because Prevost's advance required a naval decision. Remaining at range offered tactical advantages, but risked delaying the joint operation, while closing strengthened Macdonough's heavier cannon considerably. The dying wind then weakened British control during approach, turning an intended broad advance into a less coherent engagement. British failure came from interacting constraints rather than simple incompetence. Coordination pressure, difficult wind, close range, damage, and command loss combined. Even then, the American line needed its prepared rotation to exploit those problems before its own firepower faded completely. At the anchorage, victory belonged to the side that could restore an effective broadside after both flagships absorbed severe punishment. On the northern road, the consequence appeared as distance. Every British mile toward Canada widened the separation from Plattsburgh. Macomb remained behind the Saranac, rather than needing to defeat the retreating army in open country beyond his defenses. The invasion had ended, but understanding its wider importance required looking beyond the battlefield toward the peace negotiations already approaching. By abandoning Plattsburgh, Prevost preserved his army but surrendered the invasion's objective, leaving northern New York beyond immediate British reach. His columns returned toward Canada with their battlefield strength largely intact, yet without the lake route needed for renewed advance. Stores left behind and reported desertions reflected the retreat's disorder, though the British force was never annihilated at Plattsburgh. That limit matters because Macdonough's victory stopped a campaign rather than destroying Britain's military power in North America outright. Macomb's defenders had achieved their purpose by holding the Saranac until naval defeat made British numerical superiority strategically unusable. The small army did not win through a dramatic pursuit. It made retreat safer than continued advance for Prevost. Plattsburgh remained American, and the feared invasion through the Lake Champlain corridor ended before reaching the Hudson Valley farther south. Macdonough's damaged squadron remained afloat among captured ships, proving that tactical survival could produce consequences far beyond the anchorage. Control of Lake Champlain stayed American, removing the logistical support Britain needed to convert its large army into territorial gains. News of Plattsburgh strengthened the American position as peace negotiations moved toward the December Treaty of Ghent that year. The victory influenced the settlement, but it did not alone end the War of 1812 or determine every term. Its diplomatic force came from denying Britain a successful occupation that might have shaped bargaining over territory and borders. Because the invasion failed, negotiators confronted an accomplished British retreat rather than an army established deeper inside New York. The decisive sequence began before battle. Chosen water, anchored formation, reserve cables, and crews prepared to turn damaged ships. During action, weak wind disrupted Downey's approach, close range favored American weight, and accumulated damage exhausted Saratoga's first battery. Then, the anchors converted unused cannon into immediate force, striking confidence before Britain's squadron could exploit Saratoga's apparent collapse. This worked because Macdonough had prepared for a predictable category of failure, not because he somehow predicted every battlefield event. The British reading had been reasonable. An anchored flagship with its engaged guns disabled should steadily lose effective resistance. Extra anchors made that observation misleading. Saratoga was nearly spent on one side, while remaining dangerous on the other. That advantage did not make victory cheap. American ships were battered, crews suffered heavily, and the defensive margin remained narrow. When the last British columns disappeared northward, the cables across Saratoga's deck explained why thousands of soldiers followed them. Subscribe for more military history told through decisions, which mattered more at Plattsburgh, Macdonough's preparation, or Prevost's timely withdrawal.